The old man's eyes reflected flames that hadn't yet touched the earth. Joseph Crow Feather stood on the ridge above Calistoga Valley, his weathered hands steady against the morning wind. Below him, the vineyard stretched like green fingers toward the distant mountains, unaware that by sunset, half of them would be ash. The sky bore no hint of smoke, no whisper of the devastation that would soon carve its name across northern California. Yet something in the ancient Apache's posture suggested he was already watching it burn. His granddaughter Maria found him there as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the valley floor. She had driven up from the reservation in Arizona, 3 days of highway behind her, carrying news of her mother's passing. But the words died in her throat when she saw how he stood, motionless, reverent, as if witnessing something sacred. "Grandfather," she said softly in Apache, then switched to English. "I've been looking for you." He didn't turn. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the still air. "The fire dreams came again last night," he said, his voice carrying the weight of desert winds. "Stronger this time. The spirits are restless, child. They speak of cleansing." Maria stepped beside him, following his gaze across the peaceful valley. Somewhere down there, morning coffee was brewing in kitchen windows. Children were walking to school. Vineyard workers were checking grape clusters heavy with August promise. The normalcy felt fragile suddenly, like glass held too tightly in trembling hands. "Mother is gone," she said finally. Joseph Crow. Feather nodded slowly, as if this news had also come to him in dreams. His sister Sarah had been the keeper of their family's stories, the one who remembered the old songs their grandmother sang during the long winters on the reservation. Now those songs lived only in his memory and Maria's imperfect recollections. She went peacefully. In her sleep, the doctor said her heart simply stopped. The hawk above them caught a thermal and soared higher, becoming a dark speck against the brightening sky. Joseph watched it disappear before finally turning to look at his granddaughter. Maria had inherited the strong bones of their people, but her eyes held the restlessness of someone caught between worlds. The reservation where she was born and the city where she had made her life. "You came to take me home," he said. It wasn't a question. "The funeral is Tuesday. The whole family will be there." "And you think an old man belongs with his dead?" Maria's jaw tightened slightly. They had argued about this before, his decision to leave the reservation 5 years ago, to live alone in this small cabin he had built with his own hands in the foothills above Calistoga. The family called it foolish pride. She called it loneliness disguised as independence. "I think you belong with your people," she said. Joseph turned back toward the valley, where morning mist was beginning to lift from the vineyard rows. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once and fell silent. The air smelled of dry grass and ripening grapes, with an undertone of something else, something that made the old shaman's nostrils flare slightly. "My people," he said quietly, "are everywhere the earth needs healing." Before Maria could respond, a gust of wind swept across the ridge, bending the manzanita bushes and rattling the oak leaves. With it came the first faint scent of smoke, so subtle that she might have missed it entirely. But Joseph Crow Feather breathed it in deeply, like a man recognizing an old friend. "It begins," he whispered. By noon, the wind had shifted. Maria sat in her grandfather's small kitchen, surrounded by the artifacts of a life lived deliberately simple. Hand-carved wooden bowls, a coffee pot blackened by countless mornings over an open flame, bundles of sage and sweetgrass hanging from the rafters, filling the air with their earthen scent. No electricity hummed through the walls, no refrigerator provided its mechanical heartbeat. Joseph Crow Feather had built this cabin the way his ancestors might have built their winter lodges, with respect for the land and suspicion of convenience. She watched him through the window as he tended his small garden, moving between the corn and bean plants with the careful attention of someone who understood that growth was always a negotiation between human need and natural will. His movements were economical, purposeful. At 78, he carried himself like a man half his age, though she could see the slight tremor in his left hand that had begun appearing in recent months. The coffee in her cup had grown cold while she wrestled with words she couldn't quite form. How do you tell someone that the life they've chosen looks like exile from the outside? How do you explain that love sometimes feels like an obligation to drag people back from the edges they've chosen to inhabit? When Joseph came inside, his hands smelled like earth and tomato leaves. He poured himself water from a clay pitcher, drank it slowly, then sat across from her at the small table his grandfather had made from oak wood. "You're thinking too loud," he said. Despite everything, Maria smiled. It was something he'd said to her as a child when she would sit at his feet, her mind racing with questions about why the sky was blue or why birds could fly but people couldn't. His ability to read the weather patterns of her moods had always unnerved and comforted her in equal measure. "I'm thinking about how stubborn you are," she said. Stubbornness is just patience that looks uncomfortable from the outside. He stood again, moving to the window that faced west toward the valley. The light had changed since morning, becoming somehow both brighter and hazier. Maria joined him, and together they watched a line of clouds building along the horizon, dark-bellied and restless. "The spirits have been calling me here for 5 years," he said quietly. "Not to hide from our people, but to be ready for something. Last night I finally understood what." Maria felt a chill despite the warm afternoon air flowing through the open window. Her grandfather's dreams had always been more than dreams. As a child, she had watched him predict storms days before the weathermen saw them coming. He had known when her father's truck would break down on the highway outside Tucson, waking her mother at 3 a.m. to say they needed to drive south with tools and water. When Maria's first marriage crumbled, he had called her a week before she herself realized it was over, simply to say that some endings were also beginnings. "What did you see?" she asked. Joseph was quiet for so long that she wondered if he would answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the formal cadence he used when sharing the old stories. "Fire walking across this valley like a great beast, hungry and wild, but not evil, child. Angry, yes. Hungry, yes. But doing work that needs to be done. The land has been managed too long, controlled, made to produce what humans want instead of what the earth needs. The fire comes to restore balance." Through the window, Maria could see a deer picking its way delicately through the oak trees at the edge of Joseph's property. The animal paused, head raised, nostrils testing the air. After a moment, it bounded away with the liquid grace that always made her think of music. "And you think you're supposed to stay here while it happens?" "I think," Joseph said, turning from the window to meet her eyes, "that some things require witnesses. Some fires need to be blessed, not just fought." The wind gusted again, stronger this time, and with it came a scent that was no longer subtle. Smoke, sharp and immediate, carrying the mineral smell of burning stone and the green scent of sap boiling in wood. Maria's chest tightened with the first touch of real alarm. "Grandfather." But Joseph was already moving, his body responding to signals she couldn't yet interpret. He gathered a small leather pouch from a shelf, tucked an eagle feather into his belt, and walked to the door with the measured urgency of someone who had been preparing for this moment without quite knowing it. "The fire has started," he said. "We need to go to the ridge." Outside, the wind was picking up strength, bending the grass and sending leaves skittering across the ground. To the west, a column of smoke was rising from the valley floor like a dark prayer against the brightening sky. The fire moved like a living thing. From their vantage point on the ridge, Maria and Joseph watched it birth itself in the dry grass near the highway, then spread with the hungry intelligence of something that had been sleeping too long. The wind pushed it forward in unpredictable surges, now racing through a grove of oak trees, now slowing to savor a barn that had stood since the 1920s. Each gust seemed to feed it, give it direction and purpose. Below them, the valley was transforming minute by minute. Cars streamed along the roads, their movements frantic and small from this distance. Sirens wailed, fire trucks, sheriff's deputies, ambulances converging on the growing blaze like antibodies rushing to fight an infection. But Maria could see what they couldn't yet understand. This fire was too large, too fast, too hungry to be contained by human effort alone. "How many will die?" she asked. Joseph stood motionless beside her, his weathered hands holding the small leather pouch. Inside, she knew, were sacred items passed down through generations: sage, tobacco, a piece of turquoise, a fragment of obsidian blade. The tools of ceremony, of blessing, of speaking with forces larger than human understanding. "Fire takes what fire needs," he said. "Our job is not to prevent this, but to honor it, to ask that it be merciful in its hunger." Maria felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. All her life, she had lived in the modern world's assumption that natural disasters were problems to be solved, forces to be controlled or escaped. The idea that they might instead be forces to be acknowledged, even blessed, felt both terrifying and somehow liberating. A helicopter passed overhead, flying low toward the smoke. Its rotors chopped the air with mechanical urgency, and Maria found herself thinking about the difference between human time and Earth time. The helicopter moved with the desperate speed of creatures who measured their lives in decades. The fire moved with the patient hunger of something that had been gathering strength for centuries. "Look," Joseph said, pointing toward the southern edge of the valley. A line of deer was moving across the hillside, flowing like water around obstacles, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Behind them came a family of wild turkeys, then a coyote trotting with its nose lifted to read the wind. The animals were evacuating with a kind of organized grace that the human evacuation lacked. "They know," Joseph said. "The four-legged ones always know first which way safety lies." He opened the leather pouch, removing a pinch of tobacco and a piece of sage. The ritual was simple, performed with the economy of movement that marked all his ceremonies. He faced the four directions, spoke words in Apache that Maria only partially understood, then scattered the tobacco on the wind. The sage he lit with a wooden match, letting its smoke mingle with the larger smoke rising from the valley. "What are you asking for?" Maria said. "Wisdom for the fire, compassion for those in its path, and—" He paused, the sage smoldering in his palm. "Understanding for those of us who must watch." The wind carried his words, and the sage smoked toward the valley, where the fire was now visible as actual flames, orange tongues licking at a vineyard's edge, yellow banners streaming from a burning equipment shed. Maria realized she was holding her breath, as if her lungs could somehow refuse to participate in this moment. "I should call my cousin in Sacramento," she said suddenly. "Let the family know I might not make it back for the funeral." Joseph turned to look at her, his dark eyes unreadable. "You're staying?" The question surprised her. Until this moment, she hadn't realized she had made a decision. But looking down at the fire spreading across the valley like spilled light, she understood that some experiences changed you simply by being witnessed. Some moments demanded that you remain present, even when, especially when, remaining felt dangerous. "Someone needs to drive you down the mountain when this is over," she said. It was a practical answer to cover an impractical truth. She couldn't leave. Not because her grandfather needed her, but because something in her own spirit was responding to the fire's call. Some part of her that had been sleeping in city apartments and office buildings was waking up, remembering what it felt like to stand in direct relationship with forces larger than human control. Joseph nodded slowly, as if this outcome had also been revealed in his dreams. "Then we wait," he said, "and we bear witness." By late afternoon, the fire had consumed 3 wineries and was moving toward the town itself. Emergency broadcasts urged evacuation, but Maria and Joseph remained on their ridge, watching the ancient drama unfold with the patience of people who understood that some stories could only be experienced in their entirety. The sun, filtered through smoke, had turned the color of old copper. Night fell like a curtain dropping across a stage lit by fire. The blaze had grown beyond anyone's predictions, beyond the neat maps and containment strategies that humans draw around natural forces. From the ridge, it looked like a galaxy of orange stars scattered across the valley floor, thousands of individual fires that had merged into something larger and more complex than their sum. The air thrummed with the sound of helicopters and the distant roar of flames consuming a century of human endeavor in hours. Maria sat on a log beside the small fire Joseph had built, watching her grandfather's face in the flickering light. He had been quiet for the past 2 hours, his attention focused inward in a way that reminded her of the medicine men she had known as a child, the ones who could disappear into ceremony so completely that their bodies became mere anchors for spirits traveling in other realms. "Are you all right?" she asked. Joseph opened his eyes, and for a moment she saw something in them that made her breath catch. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of profound recognition, as if he was seeing something long awaited finally arriving. "The fire has reached the Henderson place," he said. Maria followed his gaze toward a cluster of lights in the middle distance that was now being consumed by a brightness too intense to look at directly. She had driven past the Henderson ranch many times during her visits, a modest spread where an elderly couple raised horses and kept a small vineyard. The kind of place that represented everything peaceful about rural life. "Did they get out?" she asked. "This afternoon, I saw their truck heading toward town when the evacuation order came." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by guilt. How could she feel relieved about strangers' safety while sitting here like a spectator at some cosmic entertainment? But Joseph seemed to read her thoughts, as he always did. "Bearing witness isn't the same as not caring," he said quietly. "The fire spirits need to know they are seen, acknowledged. Without witnesses, destruction becomes merely destruction. With witnesses, it becomes transformation." A great shower of sparks erupted from the direction of the burning ranch, climbing into the night sky like inverse stars. Maria found herself thinking of her mother's funeral, still days away and hundreds of miles distant. Sarah Ironcloud had been buried according to Apache tradition, with ceremony and songs and the kind of communal grieving that helped the dead find their way to whatever came next. What kind of ceremony did the land itself require when it was dying and being reborn simultaneously? "Tell me about the fire dreams," she said. Joseph was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the formal cadence of storytelling, the rhythm that Apache elders used to pass important knowledge from one generation to the next. "They began 5 years ago, just after I decided to leave the reservation. At first I thought they were personal dreams, messages about my own life burning away, starting over. But then I realized the fire in the dreams was always this fire, always this place. I was being called to be here, to serve as a bridge between the fire spirits and the human world." He stood and walked to the edge of their small camp, where the ridge dropped away toward the valley. The fire had spread so far that it looked like a second sunset blazing along the horizon. "In the old days," he continued, "our people understood that fire was not our enemy. Prairie fires, forest fires, they were part of the earth's way of staying healthy. We learned to read them, to work with them, to know when to fight them and when to get out of their way. But the white man's way is to fight every fire, to prevent every fire, until the land becomes so sick that when fire finally comes, it comes as destruction instead of healing." Maria joined him at the edge, feeling the heat from the distant flames on her face even from miles away. "And you think this fire is healing?" "I think this fire is trying to heal. Whether it succeeds depends partly on us, on whether we can receive it as medicine instead of poison." Below them, a massive oak tree that had stood for perhaps 2 centuries burst into flame, its crown exploding in a firework of sparks and light. Maria felt something like grief, but also something else, a recognition that the tree's burning was magnificent, even in its sadness. The oak had been dying slowly for years, she realized. its roots struggling in soil that had been compacted by machinery, its branches heavy with stress from decades of drought and heat. The fire was giving it a death that matched the grandeur of its life. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked. "Tomorrow, the fire will have passed through. The valley will look like the surface of another planet. People will weep for what they've lost, and that weeping will be necessary. But underneath the ash, the soil will be rich with minerals that haven't been available for decades. Seeds that have been waiting in the earth for years will finally sprout. The land will begin to remember how to be wild." A coyote howled somewhere in the darkness behind them, its voice rising and falling in harmonics that seemed to echo the fire's own song. Maria shivered, though the night was warm. "And us? What happens to us?" Joseph turned from the flames to look at her, and in his weathered face she saw something she had never noticed before: a deep, unshakable peace. "We go home," he said simply. "But first, we finish bearing witness." Dawn came pale and strange, filtered through air thick with ash and the ghosts of everything that had burned. Maria woke on the ridge where she had finally fallen asleep sometime after midnight, her body stiff from sleeping on the ground and her throat raw from breathing smoke. The fire had passed them by, following some invisible logic that took it south toward the highway and east toward the mountains, leaving their small camp untouched except for a fine layer of ash that covered everything like snow. Joseph was already awake, sitting in the same position where she had last seen him before exhaustion finally claimed her. He looked like he hadn't moved all night, like he had maintained his vigil while she slept. His weathered hands were folded around a cup of coffee that steamed in the cold morning air. "How bad is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He handed her a second cup of coffee, already prepared, still hot enough to warm her hands through the ceramic. The simple gesture felt like communion, like the sharing of bread after a long fast. 1,500 acres, he said quietly. 3 wineries, 12 houses, the old schoolhouse on Maple Street. He paused, sipping his coffee. No one died. Maria felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. She had spent the night haunted by images of families trapped in their cars, children separated from parents in the chaos of evacuation, elderly people who couldn't move fast enough to outrun the flames. The knowledge that the fire had taken buildings but spared lives felt like a kind of miracle. "How do you know?" Joseph nodded toward a small radio sitting on a stump near their fire. Its antenna was extended, and she could hear the faint crackling of emergency broadcasts. "Been listening since 4 this morning. The fire chief said it was the most organized evacuation he'd ever seen, like the animals taught the people how to move." They sat in companionable silence, drinking coffee and looking down at the valley that had been transformed overnight into something unrecognizable. Where yesterday there had been neat rows of grapevines and orderly farmhouses, there was now a landscape that looked lunar, gray and black and silver, with the skeletal remains of trees standing like monuments to what had been. But as the light grew stronger, Maria began to see other things. Green patches where the fire had skipped over small valleys and creek beds. Intact barns that had somehow survived while the fields around them burned. A cluster of oak trees on a distant hillside that stood untouched, as if the fire had deliberately flowed around them. "It chose," she said, understanding flooding through her. "The fire chose what to take and what to leave." Joseph nodded. "Fire spirits are not mindless. They have their own wisdom, their own purposes. Yesterday's burning will allow new life to grow in patterns that have been impossible for decades." As if to prove his point, a red-winged blackbird landed on a fence post at the edge of their camp. The post was charred black on one side but unburned on the other, and the bird perched there as calmly as if nothing had changed. Its song cut through the morning air, liquid and joyful and completely unafraid. "I need to call my family," Maria said suddenly. "Let them know I'm alive, that we're both alive." Joseph reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a cell phone, a detail so incongruous with his deliberately simple lifestyle that Maria almost laughed. At her expression, he shrugged. "Even shamans need to check in sometimes," he said. She took the phone and walked a few steps away, searching for signal. When the call connected, her cousin Elena answered on the first ring, her voice tight with worry. "Maria? Thank God. We saw the news about the fire. Are you safe? Is grandfather safe?" "We're fine," Maria said. "We stayed up on the ridge. The fire missed us." "Stayed? What do you mean stayed? Why didn't you evacuate?" Maria looked back at Joseph, who was stirring their small fire and adding fresh wood. How could she explain that some experiences required presence, that running away would have been not just dangerous but somehow spiritually impoverishing? "Grandfather needed to be here," she said finally, "to witness it, to bless it, I guess." Elena was quiet for a moment. Then, "And you needed to be with him." "Yeah, I needed to be with him." "The funeral is tomorrow. Will you make it?" Maria felt the weight of divided loyalty settle in her chest. The family gathering to say goodbye to her mother. The proper ceremonies. The shared grief that would help everyone begin to heal. All of it important, all of it necessary. But she also felt the weight of what she had experienced on this ridge. The fire had changed something in her, burned away some layer of herself that she hadn't even known was there. The woman who went back to the reservation for her mother's funeral would not be the same woman who had driven up here 3 days ago. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Let me call you tonight." After she hung up, she rejoined Joseph by the fire. He was preparing breakfast, eggs and tortillas cooked on a flat stone heated by the flames, with the same careful attention he brought to ceremony. "She wants to know if you're coming to Sarah's funeral," she said. Joseph nodded, unsurprised by the question. "What did you tell her?" "That I'd call tonight. But Joseph—" She hesitated, then pushed forward. "I think you should come. Mother loved you. The family needs to see that you're all right. That this—" She gestured at the burned valley below them. "That this hasn't broken you." Joseph was quiet while he cooked, turning the tortillas with a wooden spatula his grandmother had carved. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful but certain. "Sarah's spirit is already traveling. The funeral is for the living, not for her. But this—" He gestured toward the transformed valley. "This work isn't finished yet. The land needs time to show us what it's becoming. I need to stay and witness that rebirth." Maria felt a familiar frustration rise in her chest. "What about your family? What about your obligations to the people who love you?" Joseph handed her a plate of food, still steaming from the stone. "What about my obligations to the spirits who called me here? To the land that needs blessing? To the fire that needs to be properly thanked for its medicine?" She ate in silence, tasting smoke in everything. Around them, the morning was growing warmer, and she could hear the distant sound of helicopters beginning their damage assessment flights. Soon, this ridge would be visited by fire officials, insurance adjusters, news crews, and all the human machinery that followed in disaster's wake. The intimate relationship between the fire and the land would be measured, categorized, and ultimately managed back toward human purposes. But for now, in this moment, it was still wild, still transforming, still teaching anyone willing to pay attention about the difference between destruction and renewal. "I'm staying too," she said quietly. Joseph looked up from his food, surprised. "Just for a few more days, to help you with whatever comes next, to see what you see in this place." Joseph nodded slowly, as if this decision too had been revealed in dreams she wasn't privy to. "The fire spirits will be glad for another witness," he said. They finished breakfast watching the sun climb higher over a valley that had been remade overnight. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, the sound of humans beginning the long work of rebuilding what had been lost. But up on the ridge, surrounded by the smell of sage and smoke and the promise of new growth, Maria felt like she was exactly where she belonged. 3 weeks later, the first green shoots appeared. Maria knelt in what had been the Hendersons' pasture, her fingers brushing against tender grass sprouting through a layer of ash. The fire had burned so hot here that it had sterilized the soil down to 6 inches, but instead of creating wasteland, it had activated seeds that had been dormant for years. Wildflowers that hadn't bloomed in this valley for decades were beginning to paint the blackened ground with spots of color. Lupine and poppies and Indian paintbrush creating a carpet more beautiful than any cultivated garden. Joseph moved slowly across the burned ground, carrying a walking stick he had carved from oak wood seasoned by fire. His movements had slowed in the weeks since the blaze, but his eyes held a kind of satisfied watchfulness, as if he was reading a story he had waited most of his life to see unfold. "Look," he said, pointing toward a cluster of oak trees whose trunks were charred black but whose crowns were showing new leaf growth. "The fire cleaned out the dead wood but left the living heart. Now they can grow in ways that haven't been possible for 50 years. Maria stood, brushing ash from her knees. The landscape still looked alien, a moonscape broken by islands of green. But she was beginning to see the pattern in what had seemed like random destruction. The fire had followed the contours of the land itself, clearing out invasive species and overcrowded vegetation, creating space for native plants to reclaim territory they had lost to human management. "The county wants to reseed everything with non-native grass," she said. "Fast-growing stuff that will prevent erosion but won't support the native ecosystem." Joseph shook his head. "They don't understand. The land is already healing itself. It just needs time and patience." They had spent the past 3 weeks walking the burned areas, documenting the fire's path and the early signs of recovery. Maria had called in favors from her environmental science background, connecting Joseph with researchers who were interested in studying the fire's ecological impact. It had given them a reason to stay, a way to frame their continued presence in terms that the outside world could understand. But the real reason they stayed was simpler and harder to explain. Something had been set in motion on the night of the fire, some relationship between the land and its witnesses that required tending. Joseph's role as intermediary between the fire spirits and the human community hadn't ended when the flames died out. If anything, it had deepened. "The Petersons want to build back exactly where their house was," Maria said, referring to one of the families whose home had been destroyed. "Same footprint, same landscaping, like the fire was just an interruption instead of a message." Joseph was quiet for a moment, watching a hawk circle overhead. The raptors had returned quickly to the burned areas, drawn by the mice and rabbits that were thriving in the new growth. "Some people will hear the message," he said finally. "Others will choose not to. The land will keep teaching until they're ready to learn." They walked together toward the ridge where they had watched the fire's birth. Maria's car was parked there. She had driven down to town that morning for supplies and to check in with the family by phone. Her mother's funeral had been beautiful, according to her cousins. The whole community had gathered, songs had been sung, and Sarah Ironcloud had been properly celebrated and released to whatever came next. Maria had felt the absence of that ritual like a physical ache, but she had also felt the rightness of her choice to stay. Some griefs required community, but others required solitude and the patient work of witnessing transformation. "I have to go back soon," she said as they reached the ridge. "My job, my apartment, the life I built in Phoenix." Joseph nodded. "I know." "Will you come with me? Just for a visit. The family needs to see that you're all right." Joseph was quiet for so long that Maria thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that had been forming over weeks of watching the burned land slowly green. "I'll come for a visit," he said. "Long enough to attend Sarah's memorial ceremony, to let the family see that the fire didn't break me, but then I'll come back here." "To stay?" "To finish the work. The land's transformation will take years, not weeks. Someone needs to witness it, to speak for it when the developers and planners want to impose their own vision on what's trying to emerge." Maria felt a complex mix of relief and sadness. Relief that he would reconnect with the family, however briefly. Sadness that she would have to choose between the two worlds she loved, the human community that had shaped her and the land-based wisdom her grandfather embodied. But as they stood on the ridge looking down at the valley where new life was already pushing through the ash, she realized that maybe the choice wasn't as stark as she had thought. Maybe there were ways to carry what she had learned here back into her other life. Maybe witnessing transformation was something that could be practiced anywhere, not just in burned landscapes. "I'll come back," she said suddenly. "Not to stay, but to visit, to help document what happens here, to learn whatever the land has to teach." Joseph turned to look at her, and in his weathered face she saw something she had been too proud to ask for directly. Approval, recognition that she was choosing to remain connected to something larger than her individual life. "The fire spirits would be honored by your attention," he said formally. Then more softly, "And so would I." As afternoon moved toward evening, they prepared to leave the ridge for what would be their last night in Joseph's cabin before driving south. Tomorrow, they would return to the reservation, to family obligations, and the complex work of explaining why they had chosen to witness disaster instead of fleeing from it. But tonight, they would sit by the fire and listen to the land's quiet celebration of its own resurrection. Tonight, they would honor the sacred work of bearing witness to forces larger than human understanding, of standing present while the world burned and was reborn. The sun set through air still faintly hazy with smoke, turning the sky the color of embers. Somewhere in the distance a coyote began to sing, its voice rising and falling in harmonies that seemed to echo the land's own song of transformation. Maria closed her eyes and listened, memorizing the sound. Whatever came next, the return to familiar obligations, the work of integrating what she had learned, the long process of healing that lay ahead for both the land and its human communities, she would carry this music with her. The sound of a world learning how to begin again. Author's note: this story was inspired by the real wildfires that have shaped California's landscape for millennia, and by the indigenous wisdom that understands fire as both destroyer and creator. While the specific events and characters are fictional, they are grounded in the ecological and spiritual realities that many tribal communities continue to honor in their relationship with the land.